On a muggy afternoon in August of 1977, James Mitchell adjusted the focus ring on his Nikon F2 camera and positioned himself behind a concrete pillar outside the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., believing he was simply documenting another diplomatic reception for the Washington Post. The assignment was routine, almost boring, the kind of bread-and-butter work that filled the hours between the rare moments of genuine journalistic significance. He had photographed hundreds of these events over his 12-year career as a staff photographer, capturing the artificial smiles and practiced handshakes of diplomats who moved through their days with choreographed precision. What he did not know, what he could not have known as he clicked through his second roll of Tri-X film that afternoon, was that one of the 247 photographs he would develop that evening would capture something that the FBI had been searching for desperately for nearly 3 years. Hidden in plain sight among the diplomats and functionaries, a Soviet intelligence officer operating under deep cover, a man whose real identity had eluded American counterintelligence despite thousands of hours of surveillance and millions of dollars spent on technical operations. James's photograph would change everything, proving that sometimes the most sophisticated intelligence work can be undone by a single frame of black and white film exposed at precisely the right moment by someone who simply knew how to look. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. James Mitchell was 41 years old that August, a lean man with perpetually ink-stained fingers and the kind of weathered face that comes from spending decades squinting through viewfinders in all manner of weather and circumstance. He had started his career at small-town newspapers in Pennsylvania, covering high school football games and county fairs, gradually working his way up through increasingly larger publications until landing at the Washington Post in 1965. The timing had been fortuitous. The capital was becoming the epicenter of American journalism as the Vietnam War escalated and the civil rights movement reached its crescendo. James had covered anti-war demonstrations where police and protesters clashed in clouds of tear gas. He had photographed the aftermath of riots that left entire neighborhoods smoldering. He had captured the faces of politicians caught in scandals and the tears of families receiving news of sons killed in distant jungles. But diplomatic receptions were different. They were exercises in controlled tedium, events where nothing was supposed to happen beyond the carefully scripted exchange of pleasantries and the consumption of mediocre hors d'oeuvres. The Post sent photographers to these functions primarily for the society pages and to maintain relationships with embassy press officers who might prove valuable during actual news events. James usually approached these assignments with minimal enthusiasm, shooting a few dozen frames to satisfy his editors before finding the nearest bar to wait out the remainder of his shift. The Soviet embassy stood on Wisconsin Avenue, a massive structure built in the 1970s with the fortress-like architecture favored by the Soviet Union during that period. Windowless lower floors, thick concrete walls, and a forbidding entrance designed more for security than aesthetics. The building had been controversial when constructed, with neighbors complaining about its size and appearance, and intelligence officials worrying about the sophisticated surveillance equipment undoubtedly hidden within its walls. The embassy was technically Soviet territory, a small piece of Moscow transplanted into northwest Washington, where KGB officers worked alongside legitimate diplomats, often under the same cover positions, indistinguishable to casual observers. The reception that afternoon was celebrating some cultural exchange program, an exhibition of Soviet photography or literature or dance. James could not quite remember which. He had learned long ago not to pay too much attention to the stated purpose of these events. They were all fundamentally the same: opportunities for Soviet officials to cultivate relationships with American journalists, academics, and politicians, always searching for sources of information or potential recruits. James positioned himself near the entrance as guests arrived, a standard technique that allowed him to photograph everyone in attendance without appearing obtrusive. The first guests were exactly what he expected: American academics wearing tweed jackets despite the oppressive heat, their name tags identifying them as professors of Russian literature or Soviet history. Young State Department officials in conservative suits, maintaining the careful neutrality required of government employees attending potentially sensitive social functions. A handful of journalists James recognized from other news organizations, there for the same reason he was: obligation rather than interest. And of course, the Soviet officials themselves, easily identifiable by their slightly outdated clothing and the particular way they held themselves, a combination of formal bearing and subtle wariness that marked them as products of a different culture. James shot methodically, working his way through his first roll of film with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Wide shots establishing the scene, medium shots of the reception area with its hastily erected banner announcing the cultural exchange, closer portraits of individual guests. His eye automatically composed each frame, balancing light and shadow, positioning subjects according to the informal rules of photojournalism he had internalized over 2 decades behind a camera. Nothing unusual caught his attention. Nothing suggested this day would be different from the hundreds of similar assignments that had preceded it. But as the reception progressed, and James loaded his third roll of film, something began to nag at the edges of his awareness. There was a man, approximately 45 years old, with gray hair and rimless glasses, who appeared in the background of several of his shots. This in itself was not remarkable. Embassy receptions attracted the same core group of attendees, people whose jobs or interests brought them repeatedly into contact with Soviet officials. What troubled James, in a way he could not immediately articulate, was the man's behavior. He was working the room with systematic precision, spending exactly 3 or 4 minutes in conversation with each person before moving to the next, his movement suggesting someone executing a predetermined plan rather than engaging in spontaneous social interaction. James had developed over the years an almost unconscious ability to read crowd dynamics, to sense when something was slightly off in the choreography of human behavior. It was a skill that had served him well during his coverage of protests and political events, allowing him to anticipate moments of tension or conflict before they became obvious to everyone else. Now that skill was telling him that this gray-haired man was different somehow, operating according to a script invisible to others in the room. James began deliberately tracking him with his camera, not quite understanding why, but trusting the instinct that had guided his work for so long. The man's name, according to the name tag James glimpsed when he finally maneuvered close enough, was Dr. Viktor Petrov, identified as a visiting scholar from Moscow State University, specializing in American foreign policy. The credential was plausible, even expected at this type of event. But something about the way Petrov carried himself contradicted the scholarly identity he was presenting. Academics, in James's experience, moved through social situations with a particular kind of distracted energy, simultaneously present and absent, their minds often elsewhere, even as they made polite conversation. Petrov displayed none of this quality. His attention was absolute, focused, assessing. He listened to the people he spoke with in a way that seemed to extract maximum information from minimal interaction, his questions superficially casual, but clearly designed to elicit specific types of responses. James positioned himself to photograph Petrov's interaction with a State Department official, whose name badge identified him as Robert Carlson, Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs. The conversation lasted precisely 4 minutes, during which Petrov asked questions about American policy toward détente, while Carlson provided the kind of careful non-answers that government officials master early in their careers. But what caught James's attention, what made him press the shutter release multiple times in rapid succession, was the moment immediately after their conversation ended. As Carlson turned away, Petrov's expression shifted for perhaps 2 seconds, the friendly scholarly mask dropping to reveal something harder, more calculating, an assessment of what had just been learned and how it might be useful. The transformation was so brief that James doubted anyone else had noticed it, but his camera had captured it, frozen in a fraction of a second on silver halide film. Over the next hour, James took approximately 60 photographs focused specifically on Petrov, documenting his movements and interactions with a thoroughness that went well beyond what his assignment required. He photographed Petrov in conversation with an economics professor from Georgetown University, a journalist from Newsweek, a congressional staffer, and at least 5 other individuals whose positions suggested access to information of potential intelligence value. In each case, the pattern was the same. Friendly approach, brief but intense conversation, subtle assessment after disengagement. James began to feel increasingly certain that he was observing something significant, though he still could not have explained precisely what. The reception concluded at 6 in the evening, and James returned to the Post's offices carrying his exposed film with a sense of urgency he rarely felt after routine assignments. He developed the negatives himself, a task he usually delegated to the photo lab technicians, because he wanted to see immediately what his camera had captured. The images emerged in the developing tray with that particular magic that never quite lost its appeal despite his years of experience, figures materializing from blank paper as chemistry transformed silver compounds into visible form. James hung the contact sheets to dry and began examining them with a loupe, studying each frame with meticulous attention. Most of the photographs were entirely ordinary, standard documentation of a diplomatic function. But the series showing Petrov's conversations revealed patterns that became more striking when viewed in sequence. The way he positioned himself relative to his conversation partners, always maintaining a specific angle and distance that James recognized from FBI surveillance photography seminars he had attended. The way his eyes tracked other people in the room, even while appearing focused on the person speaking to him. Most tellingly, the micro-expression James had captured when Petrov's guard dropped for those 2 seconds, revealing an intensity and calculation completely at odds with the benign academic persona he projected. James sat in the dark room for perhaps 20 minutes, staring at those particular frames and wrestling with a decision. He could simply process the images for the society pages as assigned and forget about his observations. After all, what concrete evidence did he actually have? Some photographs of a man attending a reception, behaving in ways that struck one photographer as slightly unusual. This was hardly grounds for accusations of espionage. James had no training in counterintelligence, no special insight into Soviet operations. He was a newspaper photographer who took pictures of events for a living. His job was to document what happened, not to manufacture conspiracy theories from ambiguous behavior. But James had also covered enough stories about Soviet espionage to know that the FBI and CIA were constantly working to identify KGB officers operating under various covers in the Washington area. He remembered a conversation with a federal agent he had met during coverage of a spy trial 2 years earlier, a discussion about how difficult it was to distinguish legitimate Soviet academics and diplomats from intelligence officers using those positions as cover. The agent had mentioned that sometimes the smallest details, behavioral patterns or inconsistencies that stood out to trained observers, provided the crucial leads that broke cases wide open. James made his decision. He printed 2 sets of the Petrov photographs, one for the Post's files and one that he would take directly to the FBI field office the following morning. He felt vaguely foolish making this choice, like an amateur detective inserting himself into matters beyond his expertise. But he also felt that the alternative, dismissing his observations because they might be wrong, was worse. If Petrov was simply an academic who happened to move through social situations in an unusual way, then the FBI would determine that quickly, and James would face nothing worse than mild embarrassment. But if his instincts were correct, if he had actually photographed something significant, then failing to report it would haunt him. The next morning, James called the FBI field office from a payphone near his apartment, a precaution he took without quite understanding why. He was connected to the Public Affairs Office and explained in general terms that he had photographs from a Soviet embassy reception that might be of interest to counterintelligence investigators. The duty officer took his information with professional courtesy and told him someone would contact him shortly. 3 hours later, James's phone rang. Special Agent David Morrison identified himself and asked if James could meet him that afternoon. Morrison suggested a coffee shop in Georgetown rather than the FBI office, explaining that he wanted to keep the conversation informal until he understood what James had observed. They met at 4, Morrison arriving in civilian clothes, carrying a leather portfolio that gave him the appearance of a lawyer or businessman rather than a federal agent. James brought the second set of prints and laid them on the table between their coffee cups. Morrison studied the photographs for perhaps 15 minutes without speaking, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed from casual interest to something far more serious. He asked James to describe exactly what he had observed, what had prompted him to focus so intently on this particular individual. James explained his observations as clearly as he could, emphasizing that he had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, only patterns of behavior that struck him as inconsistent with the academic identity Petrov was projecting. Morrison said that James's observations were remarkably astute and that the photographs might indeed be significant. He asked if James would be willing to come to the FBI field office the next day to provide a formal statement and view some additional photographs. He also asked, with careful emphasis, whether James had discussed his observations with anyone at the Post or shown the photographs to his editors. James said he had not. Morrison nodded and told him that would be best, at least until the FBI could determine whether Petrov was actually of counterintelligence interest. The following afternoon, James sat in a conference room at the FBI field office, looking at surveillance photographs that had been taken over the previous 2 years. Morrison and another agent, Special Agent Catherine Walsh, explained that the FBI had been investigating several suspected Soviet intelligence officers operating in the Washington area under various covers. One of their primary targets was a man they believed to be a senior KGB officer, running agents and gathering intelligence on American foreign policy. But they had been unable to definitively identify him despite extensive surveillance and technical operations. Walsh pulled out a series of surveillance photographs showing a man entering and leaving various buildings in Washington, meeting with individuals in parks and restaurants, always maintaining sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques. The photographs were taken from considerable distances with telephoto lenses, and the subject's face was often obscured by hats, sunglasses, or the angle of the camera. But Walsh said that signals intelligence and human source reporting had confirmed that this individual was indeed a KGB officer of significant rank, operating under an unknown cover identity. James studied the surveillance photographs carefully, comparing them to his own images from the embassy reception. The physical characteristics were similar. Age, height, build, and coloring all matched, but the surveillance photographs were simply not clear enough to make a definitive identification. He told the agents this honestly, saying that he could not be certain the person in their surveillance photographs was the same man he had photographed at the reception. Morrison and Walsh exchanged glances. Walsh said that was actually what made James's photographs so valuable. His images were clear, well-lit, close-range portraits that showed Petrov's face from multiple angles under optimal conditions. If Petrov was indeed the individual they had been surveilling, James had captured the first high-quality photographs of him, images that could be used to identify him definitively. Over the following weeks, the FBI conducted intensive investigation into Viktor Petrov's background and activities. What they discovered confirmed James's instincts and validated the investment of resources his tip had triggered. Petrov had entered the United States 3 years earlier on a legitimate academic visa, arriving from Moscow with impeccable credentials from Moscow State University and letters of recommendation from respected scholars. He had spent several months at Georgetown University as a visiting fellow before transitioning to what he described as independent research, supported by grants from Soviet academic institutions. His visa status was entirely legal. His activities appeared innocuous, and he had attracted no particular attention from immigration authorities or academic institutions. But intensive surveillance revealed patterns that contradicted his scholarly cover. Petrov maintained regular contact with known KGB officers attached to the Soviet embassy, meetings that occurred in locations and at times designed to avoid detection. He used sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques when traveling to these meetings, employing vehicle switches, sudden direction changes, and systematic monitoring for surveillance that demonstrated professional training rather than amateur paranoia. Most significantly, signals intelligence detected encrypted radio transmissions from a location eventually traced to Petrov's apartment, communications that used frequencies and protocols associated with Soviet intelligence services. The FBI also discovered that several of the individuals Petrov had conversed with at the embassy reception, people James had photographed him speaking with, had since been contacted by Petrov through various pretexts. The Georgetown economics professor received an invitation to present his research at a conference in Moscow. The congressional staffer was offered a consulting position with a think tank that the FBI believed was a front for Soviet intelligence operations. The State Department official found himself seated next to Petrov at a dinner party hosted by what appeared to be a legitimate academic foundation, but was actually organized specifically to facilitate their interaction. Morrison called James 6 weeks after their initial meeting and asked if they could meet again at the same Georgetown coffee shop. This time, Morrison brought a thick file folder and a letter on FBI stationery. He explained that James's photographs and observations had been instrumental in identifying Petrov as Colonel Alexei Volkov of the KGB, a senior intelligence officer who had been operating undetected in Washington for 3 years. Volkov was not simply gathering information himself, but was running a network of agents and sources, coordinating intelligence collection on American foreign policy at a crucial moment in U.S.-Soviet relations. The letter Morrison handed to James was from the FBI director, expressing appreciation for his assistance in a matter of national security. Morrison emphasized that James's cooperation had helped protect classified information and potentially prevented the recruitment of additional sources by Soviet intelligence. But he also emphasized that the investigation was ongoing, and that for James's own safety and the integrity of the operation, he needed to maintain absolute secrecy about his involvement. No one at the post could know. No friends or family members could be told. For all practical purposes, James's observation at that embassy reception had never occurred. James struggled with this requirement in the weeks that followed. He had uncovered what appeared to be a significant espionage case, contributed to a successful counterintelligence operation, and potentially affected matters of national security. Yet he could tell no one, could claim no credit, could not even explain to his editors why he had printed extra photographs from what should have been a routine assignment. The photos he had submitted to the Post for publication were entirely ordinary images of the reception, with no indication of the drama unfolding behind the scenes. His negatives that told the real story remained locked in his apartment, a secret he carried alone. 3 months after the embassy reception, James received a phone call from Morrison asking him to come to the FBI office immediately. When he arrived, he found Morrison and Walsh waiting with news. The FBI had arrested Volkov that morning as he attempted to leave his apartment for what appeared to be a scheduled meeting. A search of his residence had recovered extensive espionage materials, including encrypted communications equipment, classified documents photographed in miniature, dead drop locations, and detailed dossiers on American officials whom Volkov had been cultivating or recruiting. Most significantly, investigators found a list of at least 12 Americans who appeared to be sources or agents, individuals providing information to Soviet intelligence, either knowingly or unknowingly. Morrison said that without James's photographs, the FBI would likely never have identified Volkov with sufficient certainty to obtain the search warrant that led to his arrest. The surveillance photographs they had been working with were simply too unclear, too ambiguous, to convince a federal judge that probable cause existed. But James's crystal-clear images, combined with his observations of Volkov's behavior and the subsequent investigation they had enabled, provided the definitive identification needed to move forward. Morrison emphasized that James might well have saved American lives by helping to dismantle Volkov's network before it could provide Moscow with intelligence that might be used against the United States. The news of Volkov's arrest made national headlines when the Justice Department announced the case 2 days later. The Washington Post ran extensive coverage detailing how an alleged Soviet intelligence officer had operated undetected in the capital for 3 years while posing as an academic researcher. James watched his colleagues cover the story with the strange disconnect of someone who possessed crucial inside knowledge but could share none of it. When his editor asked if he had ever photographed Volkov at any embassy events, James looked through his files and confirmed that yes, he had a few shots from a reception several months earlier. The editor used one of James's innocuous images to illustrate the Post's coverage, never knowing that other frames from that same roll of film had triggered the investigation that led to the arrest. Volkov's case went to trial 8 months later. The government presented overwhelming evidence of espionage, including intercepted communications, physical surveillance, and the materials recovered from his apartment. Volkov's defense attorneys argued that the search warrant had been obtained based on insufficient evidence, that their client was simply an academic whose legitimate research activities had been misinterpreted by paranoid counterintelligence officials. The prosecution responded by presenting expert testimony about the sophisticated intelligence tradecraft Volkov had employed, the encrypted communications he had transmitted, and the classified information found in his possession. James's name never appeared in the court documents. His photographs were not presented as evidence, having served their purpose in the investigation phase but being deemed unnecessary for prosecution. Volkov was convicted on multiple counts of espionage, and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The trial revealed that he had successfully recruited at least 3 American sources who provided classified information about U.S. foreign policy toward the Soviet Union during a critical period of détente negotiations. His network had also conducted extensive surveillance on American officials, identifying vulnerabilities and opportunities for recruitment. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, noted that Volkov had betrayed the trust that came with his academic credentials and had abused the openness of American society to gather intelligence that could be used against the United States. 2 years after Volkov's arrest, James received another call from Morrison, this time inviting him to lunch at a quiet restaurant far from the FBI office or the Post's newsroom. Morrison arrived with Walsh and a third individual, who introduced himself only as Mr. Cooper from the Central Intelligence Agency. Cooper explained that the CIA had been conducting a damage assessment of Volkov's espionage activities, examining what information he had collected and how it might have affected American interests. The assessment had concluded that Volkov's network had been one of the most successful Soviet intelligence operations in Washington during the 1970s, gathering information that had given Moscow significant insights into American decision-making at a crucial moment in the Cold War. Cooper said that James's role in dismantling this network, his simple act of paying attention at a diplomatic reception and trusting his instincts enough to report what he had observed, had made a genuine contribution to American national security. The CIA wanted to acknowledge this contribution formally, though it would have to remain classified. Cooper handed James a letter signed by the CIA director, expressing appreciation for his assistance to the intelligence community. He also handed him a small box containing a medal that James was told he could never display publicly, but should understand represented genuine gratitude from his country. James sat in the restaurant, holding the medal and feeling a mixture of pride and strange disappointment. He had helped uncover a Soviet spy network, contributed to a significant counterintelligence success, and received official recognition from both the FBI and CIA. Yet he could tell no one about it, could not explain to his colleagues or family why he sometimes seemed distracted, or why he paid such careful attention to faces in crowds. He had to carry the secret of his contribution alone, knowing that his moment of vigilance at a routine embassy reception had mattered in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. Morrison seemed to understand James's ambivalence. He said that most intelligence work happened exactly this way, through small acts of observation and reporting by ordinary citizens who happened to be in the right place at the right time and chose to speak up rather than dismiss their concerns. The dramatic spy cases that made headlines were almost always the culmination of countless small contributions by people whose names would never appear in the final story. James had provided one such contribution, and the fact that it would remain secret did not diminish its value. Over the following years, James continued his work as a photographer for the Washington Post, covering the same diplomatic receptions and political events he had always covered. But he paid closer attention now, studying faces and behaviors with heightened awareness, occasionally spotting inconsistencies or patterns that made him wonder if he was observing something beyond the surface reality. He never again reported his observations to the FBI, partly because nothing he saw rose to the level of what he had observed with Volkov, but also because he understood that his first tip had been remarkable precisely because it was based on genuine instinct rather than the hypervigilance that came from knowing what to look for. In 1985, James retired from the Post after more than 30 years as a staff photographer. His colleagues threw him a farewell party where they displayed a retrospective of his work, photographs spanning 3 decades of American history. Images of protests and political conventions, of natural disasters and presidential inaugurations, of ordinary moments made significant by his eye for composition and light. The photographs he was most proud of, the series that had helped identify a Soviet intelligence officer and dismantle an espionage network, were not included in the display. They remained in a file folder in his apartment, a secret he would carry for the rest of his life. 20 years later, in the mid-1990s, after the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had collapsed, some of the classified files related to Volkov's case were declassified and released to researchers. James read about the case in a book about Soviet espionage in America, recognizing details he remembered from his involvement, but seeing them described from different perspectives. The book mentioned that Volkov had been identified through surveillance operations, but did not specify how that identification had been made. James's name appeared nowhere in the text. His contribution remained classified, too sensitive to reveal even decades after the events. James died in 2004 at the age of 68. His obituary in the Washington Post celebrating his distinguished career as a photojournalist who had documented crucial decades of American history. The obituary mentioned his coverage of civil rights demonstrations and anti-war protests, his portraits of politicians and celebrities, his ability to capture decisive moments with exceptional clarity. It did not mention that one photograph taken at a routine diplomatic reception in 1977 had helped uncover one of the most successful Soviet spy networks operating in Washington during the Cold War. That story remained classified, locked in FBI and CIA files that might not be opened for another generation. But in the offices of the FBI's counterintelligence division, James Mitchell's name appeared in internal training materials used to educate new agents about the importance of human observation and civilian cooperation. His case was cited as an example of how ordinary citizens with no intelligence training could provide crucial leads simply by paying attention and trusting their instincts. The photographs he took that August afternoon were used to illustrate how even routine documentation could capture significant details when the photographer possessed skill and awareness. The Volkov case, as it came to be known within the intelligence community, represented both a success and a cautionary tale. Success because it demonstrated that sophisticated espionage operations could be detected and disrupted through attentive observation and thorough investigation. Cautionary because it revealed how easily Soviet intelligence had penetrated American society, how effectively trained officers could maintain cover for years while conducting espionage activities in plain sight. For James Mitchell, the case represented something different. It was a reminder that photography was more than technical skill or artistic vision. It was fundamentally about seeing, about paying attention to details that others might overlook, about recognizing when something in the frame did not quite fit the expected pattern. These same skills that made him an effective photojournalist had also, in one crucial instance, made him an inadvertent participant in the secret struggles of the Cold War. The roll of film James exposed at that embassy reception in August 1977 contained 247 photographs. Most documented nothing more significant than diplomatic small talk and institutional hospitality. But one sequence of images captured a Soviet intelligence officer in an unguarded moment, revealing patterns of behavior that contradicted his cover identity. That brief revelation, frozen on silver halide film by a photographer who trusted his instincts, became the thread that investigators pulled to unravel an entire espionage network. In the history of Cold War counterintelligence, James Mitchell's contribution was modest compared to the work of professional spies and career intelligence officers, but it demonstrated an essential truth about intelligence work that often gets lost in dramatic accounts of daring operations and sophisticated technology. The most elaborate deceptions can be undone by simple observation. The most carefully constructed covers can be penetrated by ordinary citizens who pay attention and speak up when something seems wrong. James Mitchell was not a spy or a trained investigator. He was a newspaper photographer who attended a routine diplomatic reception and noticed something that did not quite fit. He trusted his professional instincts, documented what he observed, and reported it to authorities who could investigate further. In doing so, he helped protect American national security at a crucial moment in the Cold War. That his contribution would remain classified for decades, that his name would never appear in the public accounts of the case, did not diminish its significance. It simply meant that he joined the ranks of countless ordinary citizens whose small acts of vigilance collectively formed the foundation of the nation's defense against threats both foreign and domestic. The photographs James took that afternoon remained in FBI files for years, preserved as evidence of how espionage could be detected through careful observation and how ordinary citizens could contribute to extraordinary investigations. They served as a reminder that in the shadow war of the Cold War, victory came not just through sophisticated operations and advanced technology, but through the simple act of one photographer who looked carefully at the world through his viewfinder and recognized that something was not quite right. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.